For a lot of people, character creation in D&D, or just really any tabletop, is one of the most fun aspects. Getting to pick your character, their class, their subclass, what kind of person are they going to be? Are they going to be a little more chaotic, or maybe a little more lawful? Are they going to be a good guy, a bad guy? There's so many choices and so many things, and after you've started to play TTRPGs for a while, you start to go down the train of giving them their little quirks. Rather it be something simple like they have maybe certain scars, certain tattoos, certain features about them, or maybe it starts to get to the point of, oh, well, they're missing a finger or two, or maybe they're blind in one eye, or maybe they're mute and can't talk at all, which, while seemingly fun and a good idea, can be a really dangerous route that you have to be very careful about when creating your character. Trust me when I say I know that maybe not all, but at least most of us want our character to have that main character energy of there's just like an aura about them that makes them really cool or really badass or really powerful or maybe just really, really sweet so everyone likes them. But you gotta be very, very careful in character creation. That's what I wanted to talk about today, was character creation and some of the things you probably want to try to avoid, because, it might cause some problems for not just you, but possibly everyone at the table. So I'm splitting this up into three main categories, and those are going to be your innocent quirks, so to speak, where it's, something that doesn't really affect anyone else. It barely affects you, honestly, and hey, it's just something that's kind of neat about your character. The second section is going to be your kind of middling quirks, where maybe they don't affect the party a ton, but they might a little bit, but it really does start to affect the character for you, and maybe it starts to affect the way you have to play them, the way you have to handle them in certain interactions and things of that nature. And then finally, for our last category, it's going to be your table altering issues or your table altering quirks, where whatever this thing is that your character does or this issue that your character has is going to affect everybody involved. So starting off, again, these are going to be your lowest level quirks is what we're going to go ahead and call them for the video today. But these are going to be things like scars, right? Where, if you have a scar across your eye or something like that, sure, some people might mention it or find it cool or interesting, some of the NPCs you run into. But barring that, it's not going to affect anything. It doesn't change the way your character talks. It doesn't change the way they interact with people. It doesn't really have a direct impact as to how your character is handled. Obviously, it might have an impact on their personality, but that's a whole different conversation. It's more so, it's not something that directly impairs you or the table. And for things like that, go for it, by all means. And these are the kind of quirks that I would heavily recommend. First off, especially for beginners, you should probably try to avoid getting too crazy of a character to begin with. But if you're wanting to lean into something a little more interesting, go for things that won't affect the table at all and will really honestly barely affect your play and won't be something you have to be super cognizant of. Because that's another part of it, is when you are role-playing, there's a lot of things to keep in mind because you're putting your brain and yourself into another person inherently, and you're trying to take over that character. So when you have other aspects that you have to worry about, it just makes it that much harder to properly roleplay to whatever, style that you're going for. Now, let's say maybe you've, graduated, you're pretty experienced in role-playing games, and you want your character to be a little more unique. Well, that's where these kind of middle ground quirks come in. And these are going to be things that can kind of affect you, but for the most part shouldn't really affect others at the table still. At least if they do, not a lot. Very minor interactions. Think of something like losing a finger or having, one less finger on your hand. For the most part, you're going to be able to do 98+% of things that you usually would be able to do. Not only that, but it's one of those things where it's not really going to affect the other players at the table. You missing a finger isn't going to cause a bunch of problems for Joe over here who has a completely separate person or whatever. It might start to impact your NPC interactions a little bit more. There might be some niche instances where certain gloves fit weirdly or something like that just because you have something in that realm. But those are the kind of quirks that you can kind of graduate to and are something a lot of players start to lean into once they're comfortable with things. So again, for one like this, look for things that might affect the character a little more and might make it a little more interesting, but understand, you want to still try to avoid things that affect the table too much. Between the middle of the road and the final big daddy quirks, it can be a pretty thin line. Okay, you gotta be very careful. Now, this is when we start to get into things that will heavily impact your gameplay. They will make you just a completely different character, and your interactions will be very different pretty much every single time because of it. Not only that, but there's a good chance it starts to affect the table as well. Whether that be the DM having to do kind of some funky things to, cope and make sure that your person isn't too, outlandish and isn't too struggling. But then also for your teammates who are gonna need to help you through certain trials. Now, this can be things such as maybe your character's blind. And usually when you do something like this, your DM will possibly maybe barter with you a little bit of hey, you're blind but you have 30 feet of tremor sense, or hey, you're blind but you have 30 feet of chakra sight in the case of Naruto 5e, right? Those are things that you can do, but I highly advise you be very careful with these when it comes to your table and your campaigns. If you pick something like being blind or being deaf or being mute or something along those lines, it can heavily impact a table. To be clear, I'm not saying this is an impossible thing you should always avoid, because having characters like that can be really fun. Having a character with a certain quirk that you have to learn to deal with the disadvantages and advantages of that character is honestly a good time, and it kind of lets the brain run wild a little bit and the imagination cook up, which can be really fun. But what I would highly recommend is make sure, one, your DM is okay with it. Don't just show up to session 1 and be like, hey, by the way, my character's blind, so, let's see what happens. Make sure to talk to them about it. I would also recommend talking to the other players, because while sure, this blind character might be super fun for you to play, because you have this plan and you have this thing where you're like, okay, I'm going to make this work and this is how I'm going to do it. The other players might not be on board, and I know it sucks, and I don't think that you should revolve your entire character around what the other people at the table want, because at the end of the day, it's your character. You're there to have fun too. But when it's something super drastic that's going to impact everyone else, be sure that they're chill with it, all right? I mean, to put a just simple example up, in combat, let's say you're blind but have 30 feet of tremor sense. As soon as you run into flying enemies, which, while not the most common things in the world, aren't impossible to run into, you are now at a humongous disadvantage. They're not touching the ground. Your tremor sense ain't seeing shit, buddy. And so really, best case scenario, your teammates are trying to call out to you where this thing is, whether it's a dragon or whatever in the air, which ain't easy. If that wasn't clear, that's not a simple thing to do. So again, for these last ones, just be very careful when it comes to picking these very unique, outlandish quirks. So again, as a quick wrap up to remind everybody, it's okay to have character quirks. I didn't make this video to try to ensure that every player from now until then has the most bland human, non-class character that just does nothing at all. Have characters with character, all right? Give them some quirks, give them some niches, give them those cool things. Just be careful and be very cognizant of how it's going to affect you, how it's going to affect the table, and especially how it's going to affect the DM, okay? They have enough to worry about. They have enough on their plate. Don't make it more difficult for them, all right? They're trying their darndest out here. But nonetheless, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. I hope it kind of gave you some insight into things to consider in your future games. And if you enjoy the content, subscribe down below. I post weekly. We got a campaign running, which I would tune in, by the way, because it's getting kind of saucy right now, and the next episode should be pretty flames. But, nonetheless, I will catch you all on the next one. Peace out.